The Blood of Dawnwalker is an ambitious open-world vampire RPG developed by Rebel Wolves, a studio of both new and veteran developers, some of which worked on The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. And about a month ago, I was invited by Bandai Namco to a hands-on event in our lovely capital of Stockholm, where I got to play The Blood of Dawnwalker for about 4 hours. And so today I thought I'd share my early thoughts on the game. But I do want to start off by mentioning a specific 8-minute video that released not too long ago from a pretty big media conglomerate. And let's just say that the reaction to that gameplay video has made people scratch their heads. And I do want to make it clear that my experience with The Blood of Dawnwalker has been entirely different from what that showcase made it seem. And hopefully some of the B-roll you're seeing here will make that somewhat clear. Alright, so let's start with the setup here and our main guy, Coen. When you start the game, the prologue is definitely, I would say, a slow burn. It takes about 2 to 2.5 hours to get through, at least it did for me. But the writing is pretty good, so, you know, the build-up, I think, is pretty worth it. And right out the gate, Coen is set up as a genuinely good person and a very protective big brother type character. Now, unlike someone like Geralt, who comes off with, you know, decades of cynical emotional baggage, Coen is younger and actually, you know, wears his heart on his sleeve. You might think that he is a little plain from the start. I think some people might think that he is when they start the game, but you can definitely lean into some edgy dialogue options, you know, to shape how people see him, and plus knowing what we saw in the teaser with a much older grizzled Coen, I am really looking forward to seeing him grow into more of a hardened character later on. But you shouldn't let the good big brother vibe fool you into thinking that the game is a, you know, light-hearted tale, because the narrative actually goes to some pretty dark places, and you're going to face some pretty brutal morality checks. At one point, for example, I had to literally decide whether or not to beat a bratty kid with a stick right after his already shitty dad just did, which is, you know, yikes. Now, I will say, while the game gives you a lot of great investigative dialogue options to dig into stuff like lore, a lot of the standard dialogue choices still feel a little bit binary at times, and they don't seem to meaningfully alter the immediate outcome just yet. But then again, I just really played 4 hours, so I guess I just didn't get to that point where I did see my outcomes play out. That said, some of them were pretty cool though. Some of the choices, like the one where you beat a kid with a stick, which of course I did because I wanted to see how far I could take it, and I was actually pretty surprised at how far that went. Now, where the writing caught me off guard was with the romance, because pretty early on you meet Anka, which is a witch and a healer, and she serves as an early love interest. Now, there is a really interesting age gap dynamic here at play, since she explicitly reminds Coen she's an old woman compared to him, and she does that all the time, which I think is pretty hilarious. But the dialogue gets surprisingly in-depth and flirty, and I think from what I saw there, I think the romance, for anyone who's really interested in romance in these types of games, you're probably going to have some cool stuff to look forward to.
Let me take a look. What about this one with the red cover?
Catalyst? Oh, no, I don't think so.
Why?
It wouldn't be appropriate. He was quite irreverent.
Meaning?
Let's just do this poem by Petronius. All right?
Now, while we're on this topic, we gotta talk about something here that is, well, a pretty debated mechanic. And for example here, if you go through a romance with Anka, you might come across a cost here because of the time management system that you've heard about. For example, you know, you can choose to spend your afternoon reading a dirty book with her, but that costs you a valuable time block, all while, you know, Coen's mother is at home sick. And that's the thing in this game, is that you start off the game and Coen's mom she's just sick, and you have to take care of her, and you have to like prioritize on whether you want to spend time doing stuff outside of the family, or if you want to prioritize your mother's health. Now, I think this is a pretty fantastic way of making your personal choices directly conflict with your main objectives, because you have to choose, either your family or other things that you find more interesting. And well, the devs even mentioned that you can just completely ignore Coen's family, if you want to. And I'm probably going to be one of those players who completely abandons the familial duty just to run around Vale Sangora and romancing people. So, sorry, Coen's mom, but I got priorities.
Yeah, boy.
All right, next up, we should talk a little bit about Vale Sangora itself, the game world. Now, if you spent a lot of time exploring Velen in The Witcher 3, you are probably going to feel at home right here, because the overall atmosphere is incredibly dour and serious. It is probably one of the most depressing games I've tested in a while. What I'm trying to say here is that there's virtually no real humor here. Like, you aren't gonna find any wacky hijinks that, Geralt might have stumbled onto early on, at least as far as I've played. But I genuinely think that the extreme seriousness does the world a lot of justice. Even though Vale Sangora is fictional, it's still set in Europe and it feels very historically grounded. It's like a cousin to The Witcher with its own distinct personality. It's very similar to how Exodus feels like Mass Effect because of the Bioware DNA at the top. Now, Rebel Wolves is really leaning into some unique mythology to separate this world from the pack. The creature design, for example, is pretty fantastic. You have weird fairies and cave-dwelling goblins, and the standout for me when I was playing was the Uriash. They're these big, beefy creatures with human bodies. They are essentially goat people, I think, and they remind me a lot of the Kunari from Dragon Age. They speak in this low and rumbly voice and construct their sentences almost like cavemen, which, it adds a pretty cool flavor to the world. Now, speaking of creatures, the vampire mythos also has some pretty great twists. For starters, victims don't seem to die when they get bitten. They apparently turn immediately, as far as I can tell, or maybe I'm misremembering. There is something very special about Coen's blood, as well as, you may have heard before from some of their showcases. He has some form of silver poisoning, I think, and that is why when Coen gets bitten, he actually doesn't fully turn yet, and he becomes the Dawnwalker. And so we gotta talk a little bit about Brencis here, which is the villain of the game, and I think he introduces a pretty cool moral dilemma. If you remember in the announcement trailer, the previous king, the human king, he was an absolute tyrant. And Brencis and his vampire cohorts, they show up and they cure the plague and they establish a relatively safe status quo. And all they ask for in return is a blood tithe for their continued protection. And the thing is, Brencis is monstrous and cruel, but the game really makes you ask if this vampire overlord is actually the lesser of two evils. And I find that really interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to how that plays out in the game. Also, we got to talk a little bit about the magic system here, because it's pretty grounded in some occult weirdness. The magic, for example, relies on physical runes that Anka gives to Coen. She gives him a matching tattoo at one point. And there's this awesome compel soul mechanic where you can actually speak to the dead, provided you possess some object that they deeply care about. Now, I don't know how deep this goes, this compel soul, if it's as deep as something like Baldur's Gate 3, where you can essentially, speak to the dead with whatever corpse you run across. But I hope it's somewhat in the same depth here with the compel soul mechanic, because I just love that type of spells where you can speak to the dead. All right, so let's talk about actually playing the game here, starting with some exploration. Now, the map might not be as sprawling as something like The Witcher 3, but I would say that it is incredibly dense. There are so many things you can do and find, and it's actually quite insane. Just look at this little clip right here of the map. It's just filled with things to do. You have a really solid focus mode too for, investigating your surroundings, which, frequently leads to uncovering hidden caves packed with loot and weapons and things like that. And traversal is also a highlight here, especially when you tap into the vampiric powers at night, like using mechanics like Shadow Step to teleport and Plane Shift to walk on walls, and it feels pretty satisfying. And one powerfully overpowered in a way, and it adds a pretty big level of fluidity to both your movement and your combat approach. Speaking of combat, Rebel Wolves has actually implemented a directional melee system that feels very similar to Kingdom Come Deliverance, and they're obviously inspired by that game. You, for example, have to choose to swing from left, right, down, or up to bypass enemy guard stances, and I thought it was pretty great, but if that sounds a little too much, well, you can switch to non-directional combat if you want to. Now, I played on hard, which was, I think it was the level 3 out of 4, and I found that defending incoming attacks was relatively manageable. And overall, the combat feel is pretty fantastic. There are also some very obvious hit-stop frames that give your swings a real sense of, weight, combined with some pretty incredibly meaty and crunchy sound effects when you land a hit. That said, though, my only gripe so far is the blocking sound, and it's this extremely high and loud ping sound that they should definitely try to lower before launch. It's just a little too loud for my tastes. Now, to survive these combat encounters, you have access to consumables like potions and pastes that buff your stats, and they're very reminiscent of Witcher decoctions. But of course, your primary way to regain health is through blood sucking if you're a vampire at night. And it is highly satisfying to rip into enemies mid-combat, and if things get really desperate, you can even drain animals like rats in a pinch to get your health back, or deer or what have you, any animal essentially that you run across in the game, but I think those are the most common ones, especially rats. Now, a little quick note here on controls. I tested it both on keyboard and mouse and on an Xbox controller, and while technically keyboard and mouse works for a third-person action RPG with this kind of momentum and combat and, the directional sword play, I feel like the controller is absolutely the way to go. All right, so moving on to some progression here, and I feel like the progression system is pretty fantastic because it's entirely tied to the world and exploring it. Because you can't just, pause the game and level up wherever you are, because if you want to increase your power, you have to physically explore the map to find and unlock specific shrines, and on top of that, you have to unlock new skills through finding skill books that are out in the world, and so it very much encourages you to explore the world, which I think is a pretty neat idea in order to push you to actually play the game. Then there are builds that you can create through witchcraft, you have sword mastery, you have vampirism, and I do love what they've done with the perks here because they aren't your standard, boring incremental 1% stat increases, because the upgrades feel really impactful. For example, you have Endless Effort, which is a perk that grants, I think, 25% stamina boost per level, and that is just completely insane. There is another perk called Stinging Blade that gives you a 10% boost to your weapon damage. So the perks feel powerful, and they really do make your build choices feel incredibly rewarding. So I think that's a point right there. While we're also talking about the menus and leveling, I do have to give a quick little shout out to the UI design. Now, the user interface stands out in a really cool way because when you sort through the main menus, the different categories visually form a sleek pentagram design here. It is a pretty great color scheme, and it looks really stylish. And just looking at the game itself, it's the Blood of Dawnwalker. It's a vampire game, so I think they've done a good job here. That said, we have to bring up some Witcher 3 comparisons here again, because when you do actually open your inventory and you start scrolling through the various item subsections and categories, the layout and the coloration and just the sheer amount of tabs are just very extremely familiar, if anything, for anyone who is a Witcher fan. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, that's up to you, but of course you're gonna see it a lot in this game. All right, so let's move on to some other things here, specifically some of the presentation and some of the polish. I gotta be completely honest here with you guys, but let's start with the positives here, because the game boasts an incredibly crisp texture, and I think they have a really strong visual direction here. The character models and the NPCs, they look semi-realistic, and there are no really wonky proportions. It just really perfectly nails that gritty, medieval dark fantasy art style that people really love. And when you get into the main cinematics, you can actually feel that heavy Witcher 3 sort of DNA in the animation, framing, and camera work. It obviously has its own style, but it is very much similar to that type of cinematic work. But this also brings us to some of the jank here. While the faces look decent throughout the main dialogue scenes and things like that, there is undeniably a animation jank present in the game. If you are coming straight from Baldur's Gate 3, for example, which obviously took a massive leap in cinematic dialogue, you might need to lower your expectations just a little bit, because the facial transitions and body movements feel a little stale and occasionally fall back on a kind of previous generation feeling. I'm not saying that it's terrible, but it definitely needs a noticeable layer of polish. Then again, I don't know how old the build I was playing was. I would assume that it's pretty close to the finished product. But again, so they could probably polish this up, but there is definitely some jank there. The biggest issue I ran into, though, in my gameplay was that there was a certain platform section that was really clunky. Because, despite how incredibly smooth the teleporting and wall walking feels in general, the standard movement has a very heavy momentum, and I like that. But Coen does this thing where he takes a few extra steps after you let go of the joystick. I think it's due to the dead zone, but let me tell you, this led me to accidentally walking straight off the edge of a tower for about 3 or 4 minutes straight. It actually made me go insane. It's probably a skill issue on my end, probably, but it was incredibly annoying. I also ran into a bug while climbing, and that was the same tower here, where instead of stepping down from the wall to the floor when I was wall climbing, Coen just continuously walked straight into the ground. And obviously this, again, was an older preview build, so hopefully Rebel Wolves gets this transition bug ironed out before release, because that was super annoying. All right, so I want to go back and talk a little bit more about the 30 days and 30 nights mechanic, or the timer, because it's one of those elements of the game that I've seen is scaring people off. And so, yeah, I just want to talk a little bit more about that. To me, it's more like a resource management mechanic rather than a timer. And the thing is, you might be thinking that the game is going to be over at the point where the timer runs out, but it's apparently not going to end right off the bat just like that. Apparently the story goes on after that point, so it's not like the game, it's game over after that point. That said, I do feel like it's not as panic-inducing as you might think from the start, because as I was playing, I noticed that, again, you have these 8 sections that you need to fill up in order to complete a full day's rotation and move on to the night. And then you need to do the same thing during nighttime. You need to fill 8 time slots, essentially, to progress to the next day. So you do have a lot of time, actually, and not every choice you make and not every activity you do will cost any time sections. Time sections being these little hourglass icons, and sometimes you need to consume them to choose, some things that you might want to do with certain choices. But if you just want to explore the world and run around and do stuff and just, I guess, mess around, you can do that, and you don't have to worry about the timer ticking. The time is technically going to stand still as you explore the world. It's only through various choices and things like that that's the timer will go down. So I'm not particularly worried about that at all, actually. It's one of those things that I actually felt brought some stability, I guess, to the game structure, because if you go off and you just do whatever and just explore the world to your heart's content, you can do that like in The Witcher 3, for example, where your main mission is to find Ciri, but instead of finding Ciri, you just go around and just do whatever else. And so you can do the same thing here, but I do feel like it brings that structure to the game where you were reminded that, oh, I should probably get to, do some interesting choices, trade off some time slots so I can see how the story progresses. So it's more like that, I feel. But then again, it might be a different experience for you guys when you try it. But for me, personally speaking, I thought it was a pretty okay system. It's not something that I was terribly concerned about as I was playing. That is to say, I'm pretty excited to play more of the Blood of Dawnwalker, but you're gonna have to wait for my review because obviously this is just a preview, so I can't give you a score or anything like that. But it was pretty fun. I'm looking forward to it. And again, thank you to Bandai Namco and Rebel Wolves for allowing me to check out the game early. And if you want more of the Blood of Dawnwalker videos, then remember to subscribe. This has been Mr. Holton, signing off.